Hello, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? All right, excellent. Might adjust this once and then that should be good. So I want to thank Steve, first of all, for putting on this great conference, and sponsors and other organizers. We need more of these, obviously, and not only do we need them, but everybody needs them. So I hope that part of this can succeed in terms of pollinating all of us as truth sharers, information sharers, germinating the revolution, right? I'm going to switch gears a little bit from Dr. Dyer's excellent talk about natural systems to talk about economic and political systems that define and dictate so much, if not everything, about what we eat, what's in our food, how it's grown, who grows it, whether we get it or not. I like to begin with a little story based on my own reporting back in the 1990s when I was actually covering welfare reform, one of the, I would say, real true disasters of the Clinton administration. Basically people were being forced off of welfare, often without much of a solution. Doesn't sound like it would be related to food, does it, that much, except for the fact, of course, that people weren't going to be able to access food as well if they were even poorer than they already were. But the story that I came across was about companies lining up to basically create a captive labor supply from welfare reform. So there was a project that I investigated in Missouri where they were sending welfare recipients to work in meat packing and poultry plants, poultry processing plants. Some of the absolute worst, most grisly, horrific work one can imagine doing, never mind the animals, of course, the suffering they go through. I'm going to say more about this as we go along. But in the process of doing these articles, I was invited to speak in various parts of Missouri. And I went out to Missouri, and basically I had written this story about welfare reform and labor abuse and super vulnerable poor people being put in a position of basically being a captive workforce for the worst labor, some of the worst labor in America. So I went to Missouri and I met farmers in different communities, and I learned more of their stories. This is in the late 1990s. And I began to understand that they were enduring and suffering through a farm crisis. We heard about the 1980s farm crisis. These farmers were going through a new round of a farm crisis. It was very complex, but one of the key factors was these large corporations that were benefiting from welfare reform and this captive labor supply were pricing smaller producers out of business. They were glutting the market, they were buying up land, and forcing small farmers out of the marketplace. So tons of pork producers, some chicken producers, it's a different kind of industry structure, but some of them, and a lot of other farmers who might have had part of their, their farm in chicken or pork, were being pushed out of the market and out of business, and were going under. So I met with them, and I drive through Main Street, and I'd see, boarded up windows everywhere, and stores that might have served farmers in the past, businesses that benefited from a diverse farm economy had shuttered. So I saw some of those conditions going on. Then, I got a lovely tour. One organizer calls it the tour de stench. I got to get some tours near these big factory farms that produce the vast majority of America's meat supply, chicken, pork, beef. They warehouse tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of animals in a single giant barn or in rows of barns that dominate the countryside. And the stench could be, on a stiff winded day, could be unbelievably horrible. There were actually studies showing that people were getting elevated rates of asthma and other breathing and respiratory disorders when they lived near these facilities from the air quality. Never mind the water quality. So I found out that these factory farms were also demolishing water systems across America, killing literally tens of millions of fish. In some areas of the country, there was actually evidence of ozone depletion in the areas where these concentrated factory farms are. So from there, I visited some of these small towns that were near the actual processing facility that the welfare recipients were being pressured into. I would go into the laundromats, convenience stores, places like that to try to meet some of the workers. Most of them were Latino immigrants, sometimes immigrants from other parts of the world, very, very poor, socially isolated, were forced to deal with racism and all kinds of other social isolation and other issues, while working in these facilities where they were getting injured sometimes within a few weeks or a couple months. I talked with workers who worked for maybe a week and they had a bandage on their arm. Their wrist hurt so much they had to leave. These were workers who were used to extremely hard work. They had done farm labor, they had done other very hard work. And they were just being chewed up and spat out. So what I learned, we're going to talk a little more about that too as we go along. What I learned from these visits was that the original story was much larger than I believed it to be or understood it to be, and that in this one instance you had one corporation defining so much of life in rural communities around the country, whether it's this one company or another. This one has now turned into Smithfield Foods, one of the largest pork processors in America. Tyson Foods was another one. They were the one who started up this welfare to work fiasco. You know, and most of the welfare recipients, frankly, didn't last very long either. So there was, you know, they were just exposed to nightmarish conditions, and within a week or two or a few weeks, they were gone. But what I learned was that there was a larger system underlying all of these disasters. That, you know, in this one case, you had one corporation, you know, using the welfare recipients and abusing them, using and abusing immigrant workers and refugees and poor people who had no other options, destroying the land, spewing their methane gases and their just like massive quantities of toxic manure. You know, we think of manure as a natural thing, and it is, and it's actually vital for farming. This was not that. This was highly concentrated, toxic, massive lagoons the size of football fields, that type of manure. So they were destroying the environment at the same time, and they were decimating Main Street in a lot of these rural communities by knocking out small farmers, which have been shown to be a vital force for rural communities across America. So that's just an initial quick little glimpse of my crash course in learning that there's a larger set of systems underlying our food crises. And that's my book, Diet for a Dead Planet, which I wrote, came out of that whole situation. Now, what I wanted to do actually, before I dive into the rest of this, is take a quick sort of gauge of who's here. I'm curious, for instance, who has a garden? All right, that's pretty cool. I don't. That's nice. Who has access to a farmer's market? Great. Wow. Excellent. And therefore, probably the same number of hands at least. Regular supply of good fresh produce and fruits. Yeah. So this is great. This is what we want, right? We want every hand up across America being able to answer those questions. So what I wanted to do is just sort of pull back and talk a little bit about big picture, big lens. What do we actually even think about when we think about food? You know, usually the first thing I think that we think about is ourselves. We have to think about where are we going to get the food we need? What do we need? What do we want? How are we going to get it? Where is it? We look around in our communities and our neighborhoods and we ask, okay, where is the good food? Do we even know? You know, so we know here in this room, do other folks even get a chance to know the difference between, say, good food and bad food? The industry loves to say there's no difference, that there's no such thing as good and bad, but we know better. So there are a lot of other issues that immediately come into play unless you are in just the absolute perfect position of knowledge and economic wherewithal and geographic access and all these other issues. So these issues start to come up. Money and affordability, income. How much is the food going to cost? What's my budget for the rest of life? How much of my money am I going to spend on food? How much can I spend? Geography and access, transportation. Do we have to drive to get to our food supply? Do we have to take 2 buses if we live in the city to get to a good food supply? Is there a farmer's market in my community? Many, more and more have them. Tons don't. Might be 30 miles away, might be 20 miles away. There's time involved, there's gas involved and pollution involved in getting to that then. There's time. Lots of people might have the money and not the time. I hear story after story of people who want to eat better. They have kids, they might be on welfare, or they might have 2 jobs and be poor. How are they going to have the time to access the good food that they want and they need? How are they going to have the time to cook the good food that they want and that they need and that they deserve? These are all questions that don't always get asked. You know, sometimes there's kind of this presentation about these are all the foods that you should eat and we should all be willing to spend more on our food. And I think that might be true for many of us, you know, to make food a priority, an economic priority. Not everybody, in fact, quite a sizable portion of the population cannot do that. How are we going to create a food system that makes the food that we know is good for us and good for the planet available for all of us? So that becomes a key question. We start to look around a little more broadly at our neighborhood, our community, our region, and we start to ask, you know, like, is food working for us? What does that even mean? So individually it might be working. We might have the money, the time, the access to have a great organic diet, to have wonderful, healthy products, to have the accessories to make amazing food, the time to make amazingly healthy food, to pair the right proteins and fibers together, you know, to do all the things that we all would like to do with our food if we have the chance. But that's not really nearly enough, is it? I mean, if we start to really evaluate, is food working, we have to ask, who is food working for and who is it not working for and how? So if we live in a community where some of us have this access and others don't, it's not working for everybody. And what part of my book is about and part of my writing and my work is about is trying to get all of us, and it was a process for me, to think beyond the individual or the family or even the neighborhood, to think beyond whether I eat only organic or I stop eating meat or I go vegan or I go raw. And those are all great things. Those are all important things. But to really broaden our lens. When I think about some of the other issues that start to come into play, there's health and nutrition, there's cost and access. Then there's the question, are we paying the real cost for food? And do we even know what that is? So, you know, there's our grocery bill, the restaurant check, the farmer's market bill, but that's not the end of the story, right? There's a whole set, and I'm going to get into more about this in a few minutes, a whole host of other costs that are not built into the cost of food that we all pay in various ways. And we pay it principally because of the system that we have today that is causing so many problems that you all have been hearing about, I think, in many of the other lectures, and that I'll say more about in a few minutes, that is creating so many of the health problems, environmental problems, the labor abuse, and other crises in our society. We're all paying for that, whether we experience the immediate suffering or not. It's around us. I mean, it's right around us in our families and communities even, people who have health issues that they may or may not have had they had a lifetime of access to fresh produce, to organic foods, to not have their food supply dominated by pesticides and increasingly GMOs and processed foods. Then there are actually other questions that I think need to be asked when we're talking about food, thinking about food. What is our food lens? So we definitely need to be thinking about the environment. We need to be thinking about the workers. We need to be thinking about Workers eat, by the way, right? And eaters work. We need to be thinking about access to food, land and markets and farmers. Trade, right? Trade is a major issue that we have to think about with food that we don't think about every day, I don't think, when we go shopping. Equality and inequality. Our taxes. What are we paying in taxes? Where is it going? And what are our taxes going to feed a system that is actually harming us and harming other people? And how can we change that? Food and agriculture policies. We don't hear a whole lot about this in the media. Every now and then there might be a little story or a headline, the Farm Bill coming up or something, and and it all sounds very wonky and detailed, and unless you're in it, you may not really pay a lot of attention. And it's not really explained why it matters to us very much, unless you're a farmer or a commodities trader or a corporation. So that gets us to the larger lens. Who makes and controls our food? Who dominates this food system? The corporations that run our food supply and dictate so much of what we eat, where it's grown and how it's grown. Basically, who's deciding food for us? And who is us anyway? Right? I mean, there's us in the room, there's us in each of our towns or cities, there's, the farm workers are generally not in these rooms, right? And that's no fault of any conference. That's larger issues in our society that I think we need to be dealing with, and they relate to food greatly. So food is a central force in our society, and I wanted to, if you'll bear with me, run through some statistics that I think help to sort of flesh this out. Have some of my fresh bottled water. So when we look around at the sort of panorama of crises, and I promise that by the end it may not be super inspiring, but it won't be quite as depressing as it is in the moment, so stick around if you can. So just in the realm of health alone, we have an obesity epidemic, overweight and obesity crisis in America, to the extent now where 2/3 of Americans are either overweight or obese. In the 1970s, that was, 25%. For kids, I mean, it's amazing. For kids now, 15% or more of kids are overweight or obese. In the 1970s, it was 4%. So we're seeing 500,000 people or more die each year from heart disease, tons more deaths from type 2 diabetes, and other diet-related illnesses that stem largely from our diet. Not entirely, but largely. More than $100 billion in costs each year to treat chronic illnesses stemming largely from our diet. $100 billion. So that's just another thing that we ought to be adding to our grocery bill, our grocery budget. The EPA estimates that at least 6,000 people a year die from cancers related to our food source, our food system. 6,000, may not sound like that much, if you're some insurance adjuster or something. No offense if there's an insurance adjuster in the room. But, that's a lot of lives. And that's, and it might be very well more than that. And those are the, the ones that they have more evidence of. There's more and more evidence that the combination of pesticides and a lifelong supply of pesticides is more and more of a factor behind not only cancer, but really wrecking our immune systems, our nervous systems, reproductive systems. So there's a lot of different repercussions from just pesticides alone. 1 in 5 Americans, including children, go hungry on a regular basis. That's basically a daily basis where they are either hungry or food insecure, as the lovely government term. I don't know what that means. Is it just some psychological, I just feel insecure about food? No, I mean, this means that they don't know where their food's going to come from. 900 million, almost 1 billion people across the planet go hungry every day. That's about 1 billion, that's about a seventh of the world. That's to say nothing of malnutrition, undernourishment. We're just talking about hunger. We have massive divides in food access, nutrition, health. I'll get a little more into that. I want to just keep on showing you this wonderful, beautiful lens of food. There's the environment, right? I mentioned that earlier. A few examples. More than 800 million pounds of pesticides are used on our food each year. 800 million pounds. So is it any wonder that we have at least 6,000 cancers alone coming from pesticides, to say nothing of all the other maladies that come out of a toxic diet, even when we're eating what would seem like good, healthy foods. 100 billion gallons, again that's billion with a B, billion gallons of oil used each year to produce our food. That's like fertilizers, pesticides, all the big giant farm machinery that's needed for the kind of system that we have, which is, as I'll mention in a couple minutes, more and more massive farms, basically producing single crops and massive harvesting machinery. So, livestock, I mentioned earlier, the Tour de Stench in Missouri. You could find this in other parts of the country as well if you're so lucky and privileged to get out there and take a smell of the non-roses. This is 1.3 billion, another billion with a B, tons of factory farm waste every year. That's 5 tons per American. Meanwhile, soil, we heard a little about soil earlier and it doesn't get talked about enough. Soil is evaporating across America. The topsoil across most of the Midwest, which is always seen as, the cradle of American food supply, breadbasket, whatever you want to call it. Most of the topsoil is already gone. And in the next 20 to 30 years, it's all going to be gone. Right? So then what do you do if you don't replenish the soils, if you don't rebuild soil and the life in that soil? And Dr. Dyer talked a little bit about this, or a lot about it actually. Then you're going to have dead soil. What do you do with dead soil? You have to fertilize the heck out of it with more chemical toxic fertilizers, which do what? They kill the soil. and they kill life, right? And then life finds a way around it, as he spoke about. We're destroying ecosystems and biodiversity in the process. Have you all heard about the honeybee crisis? Yeah, okay, so I won't belabor that too much, but it's a huge issue, and it's not just, oh, we like bees. It's like these are the pollinators, that are behind so much of our essential food supply, and so much behind the food supply that we need more of, not less of. And so their ecosystems are being demolished as well. We have evidence, again, of ozone depletion. 35,000 river miles have been polluted by the factory farm system in America. 35,000 just by meat production alone. All right, moving on. Oh, one other key issue, climate change. I'll talk a few more minutes about this too. Food is now the top source of climate change across the globe. The way that food is produced is the single biggest source of climate change. So this has to be factored in to all the repercussions of the kind of food system we have today. I spoke earlier about workers, farm workers, meat packers. Let's not forget kitchen workers as well. Our whole food system is built on exploitation. The whole system. We have to think about that for a minute. I have to kind of brace myself to think about that. Like all of it, the whole food system, would not exist as it exists now without severe exploitation of farm workers. This is true even in many organic farms, especially the large-scale organic farms. So organics is not always, they've been seen to be just as abusive as non-organic farms in many cases. So unless we think hard about this, it's going to keep happening. Along with that set of situations, conditions for the workers, we see like 2/3 of farm workers living in poverty, for instance, under the poverty level. There are more and more cases of them living in tents and canyons and not having any health care access. I've been to some of these communities in the past, and these are extremely hardworking folks, just trying to survive, sometimes do a little better than survive, often not survive. Meanwhile, they're being exposed to toxic chemicals. Many of them get ill each year and go to the hospital from sprayings. They're also being denied legally any legal mandate that they get shade and water on the job. So, you know, can you believe that, like, there's a fight over this now, right? Like, so in California, it took years just to get a law through that would say, yes, we're going to make sure that farmers have shade and water, right? And so, you know, in California, you know, is known generally to be one of the more progressive, advanced states in terms of farm labor law. I don't know what it's like in New York, but you know, it's probably not better. Let's put it that way. Just to give you a few more lovely examples, I've talked to a lot of these chicken factory workers, and I mean, the kinds of conditions that they're exposed to are really phenomenally bad. You know, I guess like it's you know, of course it's not going to be a great job, right? But you know, what amazed me when I went in and talked with people is like, studied this more, is just how bad it is. You know, like 90 birds, it used to be 90 birds, it'll be higher, as I'll tell you in a minute. 90 birds a minute going down the assembly line. Workers getting carpal tunnel at 7 times the rate of other workers. You know, constant turnover lasting a couple weeks or a few months. Even, you know, perhaps more, you know, glaring than that, workers denied bathroom breaks. Workers wearing diapers on the job because they're denied bathroom breaks. This is happening in the chicken factories and the pork processing factories of America. So just brutal stories, and I'm not going to, you know, detail too much more of that. In farm labor, there are more and more cases of women in particular, well, altogether, being sexually harassed and raped. There was a great series called Rape in the Fields by some colleagues of mine that looked at this epidemic of rape and sexual assault among female farm workers in the fields. Other indignities happen to women in the meatpacking plants. You know, women who are pregnant and denied bathroom breaks, even when they have morning sickness, things like that. So this is what's happening in the labor force. Now for a quick spin to another piece. How y'all doing? Great, okay, good. What do you mean great? This is terrible. Depressed. Well, it's gonna get, what? We'll come around to some better stuff. Farmers, we can't forget about farmers, right? Small farmers are enduring a crisis across America. We're losing actually one farmer every half an hour in this country. Every half an hour, farmers going under. 100,000 farmers went under between 2007 and 2012. So, you know, what are the reasons for this? We have land consolidation, we have corporations controlling markets, you know, expenses for fuel going up, you know, those 100 billion gallons of fuel. And another key factor is farmers' share of the food dollar. So back in the 1950s and 40s, they were getting almost half of the food dollar, about 40 cents of every food dollar go to farmers. Now it's a nickel. So, you know, there are many reasons for that. We have more and more processed food, and again, it's run by more and more run by corporations, so the farmers have less and less negotiating power to survive. The subsidy system that we have in America, to the tune of, on the average, about $15 to $20 billion a year, a lot of it's been moved over to crop insurance, but it's basically the same system, prioritizes large-scale commodity production, monocrop production, again, putting a lot of small farmers out because they're not getting the subsidy help. They're not getting the incentives to produce. The large-scale producers are getting all the incentives. So, you know, 2/3, 70% of subsidies going to the top 10% of farmers. More and more land is being lost to development. Literally millions of acres across America have been lost to development in the past decades. We're seeing a situation where the vast majority of farms in America are small farms, just by the number of actual farms, but less and less of the actual farmland in America is run by small farms. So we have 2,000 acre, 5,000 acre, 10,000 acre giant farms, again, producing 1 or 2 crops across more and more of America. So again, those main streets across these small towns in America, rural areas, are becoming impoverished. This was their main livelihood. And in more and more of these small towns and even mid-sized towns across America, they don't have that diversified economy. They've, it's their retail sector has been taking a hit. All those other factors have to come into play. Basically, maybe one more statistic I'll throw at you. I don't want to throw too many more. Since the 1960s, more and more farms, well, in the 60s, as recently as then, we had farms that were diversified. More and more of these farms today just grow one crop. So it's another evidence of, they used to have chickens and hogs and then their vegetable supply. And now today, fewer and fewer farms have any hogs or any chickens. And as a vegetarian, you might think, well, big deal, that's good, right? But they're an indicator of the farm economy, right? There are other ways for us to solve this. We don't have to start transporting hogs and chickens out to every farm but we do need to restructure the farm economy. And one of the traditional indicators was if you had a full system on your farm and you grew the feed for your animals, and maybe your animals weren't always being butchered or processed, or maybe in small numbers and they were organic and they were free range, all those other questions. Another key piece that we need to think about in our food system that I mentioned earlier is the food divide and food access. I often call it food segregation. We have huge nutritional divides in America. So poor communities, a lot of communities of color, immigrant communities, lower income white communities have huge nutritional deficits. And study after study has shown that if you don't have regular access to produce and fresh foods, you're likely to have nutritional deficits. Kids are not performing well in school, right? There's more and more stories of that. Even as some of the school lunch systems get better, kids in poor areas don't have any food or any fresh food. So they're going to school maybe with chips and soda. So they can't perform well. So this affects a whole range of conditions for their life and what they can become. So we need to think about that as well. There's a history of racism in our food system that has to be remembered and thought about that's still happening today, with supermarket redlining, supermarkets refusing to go into communities of color, particularly black communities across lots of parts of America and cities. Discriminatory lending practices that basically refuse to give loans or good loans to black farmers in the South in particular, and some parts of the Midwest as well. So that's a history that we have to keep in mind. And again, this global and domestic system where some of us have what we want, what we need in great quantities, and then millions of us don't. So thinking for a minute, building the lens out even further, I want to speak for a few minutes about the global system of food. This is where we get into, how is it that we have these problems? So if we look at food beyond community, beyond farmlands, beyond workers, and we look at the role of food in trade, in nation building, in building economic and political power, in even war, and the history of war, in terms of both raiding other countries' land and resources, but also in terms of developing this cheap commodified food supply for both a lower wage workforce, but also for soldiers. There's a long history of this that's well documented as well. So we have to ask, why is food the central force behind what I would say are the two greatest crises across the globe today, climate change and hunger? And the answer, if we look around, we see that corporations, again, are controlling food systems, not only in America, but around the world. And they control the trading of food. They control the distribution of food, the access to food, the access to land and credit and markets. All these things are controlled by small handfuls of corporations. I'm going to give you a few yummy details about that in a minute. So when we look around the world, in terms of climate change, for instance, we see deforestation. How many of you are familiar with this? You heard a little bit about this? Okay, good. So, in classic cases, Indonesia, Indonesia has devastated its forest lands in the name of palm oil production. Why would it do this? Do Indonesians not care about forests? Of course they do. Money, economic power, nation building. How does the nation and how do these corporations that run these systems drive a set of policies to make food production more profitable not for everybody, but for a handful of people, a handful of shareholders? And how do nations, they're forced, in some ways they're forced, to be honest, poor nations, smaller nations are forced to plunder their own resources to survive in a global capitalist economy and society. That's just the reality. Whatever we might think of it, that's what's going on. So the other piece of it is that, in the case of palm oil, we're all using palm oil, right? I mean, maybe not all of us in this room. Good, see, there's somebody who's probably doing better than I'm doing, but I try. I do look at the ingredients. I've written some of these studies, reports, and it's just, it's one of the key factors behind climate change, behind food's role in climate change, is deforestation to create vast plantations, palm oil plantations, as one example. I mean, it's also happening in meat and dairy and grain as well. So palm oil is not the only villain. That's another sort of trap we can fall into with food, is to just kind of point to a couple of villains as if that's the end of the story. But again, it's systemic. So it's not just Indonesia's fault, it's the global food system's fault, right? Part of the explanation behind just that situation alone, which should be enough to force change. If deforestation is one of the leading factors behind the biggest environmental crisis of our lifetimes, then why would we not, never mind any of this other stuff, why would we not make that something to fight on and organize around? And again, it's a key ingredient in processed foods and processed other products, right? Soaps, shampoos, other products, tons of other products. These amazing foods, these are like wonderful, incredible elements of nature that are getting used in all these wrong ways. So I want to do, if you can bear with me again, I'd like to give you a few more statistics, but I think these are important. When we talk about the corporate control over food, I don't know if everybody's familiar with just, again, the extent of the situation and the crisis. So in America, 4 corporations control around 85% of the meat production, the beef production in America. 4 corporations control 50 to 60% of the chicken production. Pork is also up there above 80%. Across every major processed commodity, including all these like flour, wheat flour, milled, these different milled products, all these major commodities, corn, soy. Again, it's 4 corporations controlling 40 to 60% of the nation's market. Now, even mainstream economists say that when you get to 40% or higher of national market control, you're talking about a serious problem in terms of, even on capitalism's terms, unfair competition. 3 corporations control half of the global commercial market for seed. All right, so the very lifeblood of the food supply is being controlled. And Monsanto, Syngenta, DuPont, a few of the Dow Chemical, a few of these corporations that are increasingly controlling not only seeds, but of course the attachment to that, which is pesticides. As Dr. Dyer talked about before, pesticides and GMOs, and GMOs, of course, come along with pesticides. Another one of these myths they like to put out there that it's somehow better for the environment, which it's not. So they control the whole set of terms on which the farmland is being divvied up and how it's being farmed, and then farmers have less and less ability to negotiate anything in the marketplace, both when they're buying seeds and then therefore pesticides and locked into those attached contracts, and then on the selling end as well. When you have these few corporations controlling grain elevators across the Midwest, for instance, it could sound like this really obscure, wonky thing, but what it means is that Cargill might be the only company that a farmer can sell to for like 200 miles. So then they're forced to this choice, oh, maybe I could get a better price, but I'm going to pay all my money in gas for my big truck, to get over there. So farmers have less and less ability to negotiate a price in the marketplace as well. More than half of the whole grocery bill goes to 5 corporations. So all the grocery food in America, all the grocery corporations, more than half of that goes to 5 corporations. Walmart alone gets a third. So 30 cents of every dollar that we're spending in America on groceries is going to Walmart, which, maybe you've read, but Walmart not only exploits, they exploit their workers, they're taking in a third of the grocery dollar. And meanwhile, of course, those same exploited workers, many of them are ending up on food stamps. And lo and behold, Walmart takes food stamps. So it's a perfect circle for them, right? One of the significant factors here, I think, when we talk about corporate control is not just the numbers, but what it really means to have these companies control. And I mentioned these markets, but it's also about, again, the kind of production that they require and that they are in the position to demand, which is large-scale commodity production and monocrop production. So again, why is it that we have like massive corn farms, massive soy farms across America, or maybe even sugar beets or wheat, these different commodities? Well, it's not just because farmers are enterprising and they want to get bigger and they want to grow all this stuff. It's what the market is demanding. But the market isn't really just us, right? It's not us saying, grow me some more wheat, grow me some more soy. But corporations that control these markets, and they control all the access points to these markets from the beginning to the end, from the seed to the supermarket, are controlling what farmers grow because those are raw ingredients for processed food. So basically farmers, more and more, unless you're a small farmer or a produce farmer, we have a lot of those in California. I know you've got a lot of great produce farms in Long Island and New York and other places too, but more and more the bulk of production across America is raw ingredients. For processed foods, who's running that? The same corporations, sometimes the same corporations. It's also one of the major suppliers for fuel, so ethanol production. And biofuels, which was years ago heralded as like the new thing. And now more and more evidence has shown that it's not helping us at all. It's helping us drive more. And it might be a little bit cleaner, but actually the net result is not cleaner because ethanol production involves fossil fuels to grow the crops and then to process it. It's insane. It's literally insane. So a lot of our corn and soy production across America, those big subsidized corporate farms and agribusiness farms, again, are also for meat production. So those same meat packing plants that I talked about before, that's what all these fields are for. Almost all of it is for the animals who live this nasty, brutish, short life, to borrow a famous literary phrase. But and meanwhile, the farm workers, the factory farm workers, many of them coming up from Mexico and Central America. Why are they coming up here? Because they're economically desperate. Things like NAFTA have made them more economically desperate. Why did NAFTA make them more economically desperate? They demolished the Mexican corn production market. So we have these cycles, these whole circles of exploitation and devastation going on that are run by these corporations. So this is true, not only in America, but across the globe, that the corporate takeover of food is defining every element of production and farmland and control. I've already spoken a little bit about the rural communities. So let's skip ahead here. I want to talk just a little bit about the actual food industry in America and its domination over politics. Because again, there's this confluence. Sometimes these things get talked about separately, and I think that that's a mistake. economic power creates political power. They're not two different things. So the corporate consolidation in the food industry enables, enables more and more control, lobbying power, both by these corporations and by the trade associations that quote, represent the soybean industry, the meat packing industry, the chicken industry. Well, who controls the trade associations? Again, it's these handful of large corporations that are dominating the agenda for that. So, you know, in our food system, you know, I want to give you one example of the kind of lobbying power. There are many examples, but one example is the chicken industry, which I've researched extensively, much to my dismay. The figure I gave you earlier of 90 birds per minute going down the assembly line, does anybody know what the number is now? Okay, good, I get to surprise you. 140 birds a minute. Now that's actually that's the mainstream chicken factory. There's actually a pilot well, it's beyond pilot program. It's now kind of becoming more mainstreamed. There's a program that now allows these chicken facilities to run at 175 birds a minute. Now this is insane. I can't even imagine anything going by me that speed without me just getting dizzy immediately. Never mind being able to actually work on that. So you might have a couple workers at one station. They might be handling, only 50 or 60 birds a minute, or in some places they're cutting a bone off, so it's 30 birds a minute. Or maybe it gets down to 25. That's a really relaxing pace, right? I've interviewed chicken workers who are hanging chickens 50 birds a minute all day long. How did this happen? This happened through lobbying power. This happened through the economic and political power and lobbying power of the chicken industry, and the complacence and compliance of politicians and heads of agencies. So the Poultry Council, the National Chicken Council, lobbies Congress and over time, and this happens, by the way, under both Democrats and Republicans, maybe a little slower under Democrats, but it still happens. They were able to get these line speeds increased. At the same time, they've transformed the food safety system for chicken, and they're doing it in pork as well and in other meats. They've transformed it to where there are hardly any actual food safety inspectors along the line anymore. So they're now in labs, they're looking over company records. More and more, the companies are self-inspecting. So they have workers in charge of inspection, of food safety inspection. And workers who do not get very much training, they may or may not be able to see what they're supposed to see, who obviously are facing all kinds of pressure and intimidation by their employer. I mean, this isn't, this is kind of a no-brainer. I mean, it's like, it's not going to work well, right? So, is it any wonder that we're seeing, tens of millions of food illnesses every year in America, for instance, salmonella, bacteria poisonings across the country. And I actually just finished a big report looking at some of this stuff that'll be out soon, and it's positively gruesome, just reading through some of these government inspection reports and seeing what happens inside America's chicken factories. And again, all of this happens because of economics and politics, because of that power that they've accrued, to lobby Congress and to lobby the government agencies. There's a constant, of course, also revolving door between industry and government. And that makes the lobbying that much easier. If you've got former industry executives or industry employees in the government agencies who understand what's at play, they understand the industry, great. So that means this is going to make it that much easier. So, research shows this happening all the time, and of course, stunningly, it's happening even more under the Trump administration. So, the swamp has gotten even swampier, not just at those high levels that we hear about, but at all these kind of lower or mid-level areas where you have tons of appointments happening that we never hear about in lower levels of these agencies, where these are people who worked in industry. And there's example after example of this. happening. And then we have just the descaling of inspection and enforcement across the board. So, one of the things that happens when Trump unveils his budget blueprint and all this is like 20% cuts in these different government agencies. What that means is fewer inspectors across America, whether it's worker safety or food safety, health safety, or ensuring that the occasional good rule on farm workers getting shade and water actually gets enforced, right? The laws are meaningless if they're not enforced. So, the food industry, just to give you one example, in 2008, spent $356 million in campaign contributions, mostly 2/3 to Republicans, but some to Democrats. In 2015, they spent $132 million on lobbying on state governments and federal governments around the country. So this is what's behind our food system. I do want to talk a little bit about how we go about fixing this food system, and I'm sure you would like to talk about that too, I hope. Obviously, we have to address the corporate power that's dominating this food system. We have to address the again, bipartisan approval, increasingly bipartisan approval of merger after merger after merger of agribusiness, of course, happens across the board, pharmaceuticals, publishing, other areas as well. But in the food industry, all of these giant corporate mergers need to be stopped. Excuse me. We need to reform antitrust law. This sounds kind of, again, maybe either boring or remote, or how on earth would we even do that? Well, we can start to do that by informing ourselves and educating others about the corporate control, and by spreading the word about, more than 40% of basically just about every major food, commodity in America being controlled by 4 corporations. Mainstream economists say this is not healthy. This is not a good way to run things. More and more discussion of the symmetry, the continuity between the economic control and the political control. That understanding and analysis has to get out there. We obviously need to be electing politicians who make this a key point in their agenda. In the presidential elections, they say almost nothing about food. I wrote a story back in 2016 called The Great Food Blackout of 2016. And it was just a story about all the things that were not being talked about, or the few things that the politicians did say, about farm subsidies or a couple other areas, but really hardly anything at all. So we have to force our politicians on every level. So, if you can't get to your congressional representative, you can get to your local representative, bringing that lens back to our community as well, what's around us? What's the inventory around us in terms of, are there enough farms in the periphery of our community? Is all of the land being gobbled up by developers? How do we develop incentives to reverse that trend? It's not going to just happen on its own, right? All the economic incentives are in the wrong direction. So, and again, that's happening for a reason. I mean, if you're having one farmer go under every half an hour in America, that's not a real economic incentive to get into farming. If you know that you're not going to have any kind of a subsidy support or some other kind of support to get into farming. If you're not going to get into farming, you're going to have more and more communities that are far away from good, healthy produce. So you're going to have more and more long-distance transport of food. You're going to have more and more pollution from that. So we have to get politicians on every level to make food a central piece of what they talk about. It's not even, most of the time, it's not even on the list, frankly. I mean, I can't remember the last time somebody running for San Francisco, where I live, we have a supervisor, it's like city council, and food never gets talked about. And yet, we all eat every day, and it's absolutely foundational to human existence, right? And if we don't address all these conditions that I've been talking about in a systemic fashion, then we're screwed, to put it bluntly. We're not going to get where we need to get to. I did want to point out some hopeful things that are happening around the country, and I'm sure some of you have examples of your own as well. We are seeing more and more examples of what works actually happening in the ground. Probably some of the companies here sponsoring this today are part of that, I'm sure. We're seeing more and more agroecology. How many folks have heard that term? Okay. So agroecology is a movement that came out of Latin America, but it's more of a global movement. It's a long-standing practice and set of practices within farming that includes organic, but also diversified production, and it's a whole set of agricultural principles, really, that also incorporates food sovereignty, so having a community have as much of its own food supply as possible. I'm not one of those sort of isolationist believers that we have to have every community have all of its own food. It would be nice, but it's not going to happen, and there are reasons why. Not every place has the right geography or climate. But I think that producing as much of our own food as we can is an optimal goal that every community should have policies around. How do we zone land? And some of this is happening on small scales. There are incentives for urban farming. We're seeing a whole urban agriculture, urban farming movement really blossom across a lot of America. And it's not even that, it's pretty significant, really. I mean, like, Detroit is a great example where you've got this like absolutely devastated urban landscape. And out of that is starting to sprout up, among other things, urban farms. And you've got folks, some of them are real Detroiters, they're not just coming in from outside, who are reclaiming some of that land. We have a situation across cities, across America, and as well as towns, where there's vacant, unused land. And so how can we develop local policies that say, that could trigger incentives to say, like, unused land can be used for farmland. All right, then you do the soil samples. You find out, what do we need to do to get it into farming shape? It might take a couple of years of cover crops and everything else, and getting more nitrogen in the soil, everything. But like, where is the policy to make that happen? We need to see policies that demand, for instance, that vacant land in cities and towns, that become one of the key priorities. Maybe housing poor people and homeless people, and growing food. Maybe those should be the two priorities for unused land, instead of real estate tax write-offs, for instance. How about it? Sounds like a better way to go to me. We do see examples, across other parts of the world where the agroecology movement, which again brings in not just organic farming, but these principles of economic survival for farmers and food security for communities and diversified food production. So it's not just like we're all having it flown in to have enough food. Millions of farmers around the world are doing this. Millions of farmers in India are starting to move away from GMO production, which has been forced on them, literally, basically almost forced on them by lending practices and marketing practices by the industry. They're starting to push back, and they're starting to demand that they grow their own food in their own way. And the importance of this is not just that they're going away from GMOs, and this could apply to places like Mexico and Central America as well, that have been devastated by not only trade regimes like NAFTA, but also by trade dynamics that have forced them to sell, their version of palm oil, for instance. So the importance of taking back land, whether it's in India or Mexico or Central America, is that farmers who have this long-standing tradition, who know how to do it, can not only make a living and not be beholden to these corporations, they can also supply food for their communities. So they can sell to local and regional markets. They can grow diversified. And therefore, you don't have communities that we now have in Mexico and actually in the United States as well. You've got farming communities that can't feed themselves, not only because they might be too poor, but because they're not growing anything they can eat. As we mentioned earlier, in terms of corporate-dominated food system demanding raw ingredient commodities instead of diversified food. So we're only going to get there by resisting and pushing back on every level, locally and globally, in that direction. You know, the battle, of course, is there's this huge gulf between these amazing solutions that are already happening on the ground and where things are actually going in terms of these political and economic dynamics. And, you know, it can drive me nuts because I feel like this is not something where we have to study more. This is, the solutions are there and they've been well proven and they are happening. And the answer, I would submit, is to get the money, the incentives, and the access to all this into, to basically reverse the whole situation in our economy and our politics. Now, wonderful, how do we do that? So just, you know, to close out my portion of this, and then I want to invite conversation and questions. We need to think in terms of getting our political systems, again, on every level, to incentivize and subsidize, whether you call it a subsidy or a form of insurance, or just a public investment. I mean, I would like to say, call it a public investment. That our tax dollars would go into a food system that nurtures us, that nourishes the land, that values farmers, that values workers that are making our food, that all these things go into the price of food that we're all paying now. And we're paying it all dearly and all in the wrong direction, right? Even if we're eating the right foods for us, the food, you know, the larger grocery bill that we pay in our tax dollars is paying for all that suffering. We're cleaning up the mess that's created by these corporations. We're subsidizing not just the $15 to $20 billion that we're already paying, we're subsidizing their practices and their profits through all the ways that we pay tax dollars to pick up the mess, whether it's environmental cleanup or you know, injured workers who are injured for the rest of their lives and who don't have insurance or money. So the public health system, such as it is, it's not much, but such as it is, picks up the pieces. And they can't work, so they get unemployment, they get food stamps. And you know, I'm all for all that. But again, it becomes, the dynamic is that all that becomes another subsidy. So instead, what we need to do is take all that investment and push, again, on every level, local. You know, go to your city council, go to your town council. What are we doing about food in our community? You know, look around us. Like, do we have a farmer's market? Great. How can we expand the farmer's market? Are all the farmers in the area using it? How can we create incentives for more farmers to use the farmer's market? How can we create incentives for vacant land to produce food, right? All these different things. How can we restructure the current $15 to $20 billion official subsidy system to be instead a public government investment in a new food system that subsidizes organic production, or so let's just say supports, that invests in organic, diversified production that incentivizes smaller scale food producers around this country, and that supports a living wage for farm workers and food industry workers. That's what we need to do. It's a long project. We can all start to do it in our own different ways, educating, spreading the word, talking in our communities, and again, talking with anybody in politics that we can get to, or organizations, talk with organizations, you know, that can get to them, and start putting this on the agenda. And together, let's keep moving toward in that direction, rebuild our food system. Thank you very much. Yeah. Oh, wait for the mic. Okay. Do we have a, it's coming. Yep.
I already know, you'll hear me, but
Right.
I agree with everything you've just said, but you skipped the most important thing. As they said in the movie, if you build it, they will come.
Yep.
If you go to your Saturday market, which on Long Island, they're all over, and buy the food, they'll get bigger. if you go and order a CSA, community-supported agriculture, where you pay for an entire season of vegetables. It's there already here on Long Island. Anybody who wants to know more, come see me. We need to change the food system, yes, politically, without a doubt. But if you're buying Hamburger Helper, they're going to make it. If you're buying palm oil, they're going to use it. On the other hand, and if you're using meat, they're going to build it. And you did skip that the worst deforestation is not palm oil. The worst deforestation is based on growing food for cattle and or grazing the cattle. We have lost Brazilian rainforest by the billions. And that's what this conference is mainly leaning at. And what we need to see is that, number one, it's the healthiest way to eat. Number two, it's the environmentally best way to eat. And number three, the animals kind of like it if we're not, I mean, back in the day when you had a happy cow and then one day it had a sad life, that's one thing. But the cruel and inhumane treatment that we are giving every animal to eat is abominable. And on the same thing, which hasn't been covered in this conference, we don't even want to talk about potable water. Even in this country. We have grandchildren, every one of us, who are going to be fighting in this country for potable water, if not our children themselves, depending on your age. We, yes, talk to your legislature, yeah, that word. But the best thing we can do is go to the Saturday market. There's one just right around the corner from this building. Again, there's CSAs all over Long Island. You think it's suburbia. Where do we go? Unfortunately, it's only 6 months of the year because we live here. But we, at this conference, need to change it with our pocketbooks. And that is what drives everything. Right. We stop buying it. We start buying from local. It'll change it. Because, and GMO, the same thing. Don't buy GMO products. It's your pocketbook, our pocketbook. Every citizen's is what's going to make a difference. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think those are excellent. No, thank you. I appreciate that. I think those are excellent points. And I guess I didn't mention them for a reason, which is that I think that that's what always gets emphasized is voting with our wallets. It's a key part of it, and I think the piece of the puzzle that's often missing is the political policy piece. Both are critical. I don't think that one or the other can happen on its own. So I completely agree. I think that it's a combination of the two. You know, it's actually not going to be enough if all we do is shop in the right way, because the policy mechanisms, the political structures, the corporate, it's a key piece. There's no question about it. But what I want to leave you with today is that it's not enough on its own. So it's vital. We should all spend money in the direction that we want to see the food industry going. We should absolutely support farmers markets, absolutely support organics, not get palm oil products. You know, I try to practice this as much as I possibly can myself. But what I want to, just add to that is, again, even as we do that, it doesn't enable every farmer and every producer to just answer the market signals because of the kind of corporate control that I talked about before. So I think, again, both are important. Sorry, she's got the mic, and then you after her.
First, I want to thank you so much, very much. I've learned so much today from you. And it sparked a lot of things, me just thinking here, living on Long Island. I'm living here about 37 years. And I've seen a lot of changes, changes that kill me almost every day. I remember when I first moved out here, my kids being in kindergarten, we used to go to the pumpkin farms right on Northern Boulevard. I mean, we used to just drive right up there. There's none. Right here on 110, there used to be pumpkin farms that you could see from the LIE. I could cry when I see all these buildings and apartment buildings. Where are they putting all these people? Just recently, they did a fight on South Oyster Bay Road there in Plainview, that road, that they took down all the beautiful trees. And they planted all these little trees. Well, I'm thinking, well, why didn't they put fruit trees, fig trees, any kind of tree? that people could just go and eat, even on the schoolyards. You know, now that they're not spraying pesticides and stuff like that, plant a few apple trees, you know, in the parks, you know, Caniac Park or any of the parks in the surrounding area. You know, things like that. You brought a lot of things to my mind, and all these vacant lands. What are you seeing? More apartment buildings. Where are they putting all these people? The traffic here on Long Island. You can't go from north to south, east to west. It takes you forever. I used to work 15 minutes away. It took me 45 minutes. You know, I just want to thank you so very much for your input and for being here today and giving us all these ideas about farming incentives and things like that to talk to our politicians and things like that.
Great. Thank you very much for that. And maybe I'll just add on to what you just mentioned. You know, I mean, every town or city can really be pushed to have a food policy, which again can then get that conversation going about, you know, whether it's a farming vacant lands or again like rows of fruit trees, other ways that food can be produced that are good for the environment as well as producing, you know, at least some of the local food supply. So we need to make that a central part of every locality's conversation.
I just wanted to make a comment that it has to start at the top, and we have to educate our politicians, because when you alluded to the 80s, I remember they changed the food pyramid. We'll start with that. But then in the school districts, ketchup was substituted for the tomato, and it was considered okay. That came down from the federal government, okay?
Yep.
Just, you know, so you got to start at the top. All right, if you really want to get things, yes, and I know the corporations lobby, but, you know, if maybe some of our politicians had a little bit of education under their belt about food, well, maybe they think differently of the food, okay? And that, you know, if you have no knowledge, you don't ask questions, all right?
Yeah.
Because you don't have the questions to ask because you don't have the knowledge to ask the questions, you know, and it needs to start up there. Okay. And I know, here's another political, I have trees. Because I have trees on my property, I'm taxed as a higher rate because I have a wooded lot than the person who doesn't have trees on their property. I'm contributing to the better environment, but I'm taxed higher because I have trees on my land, okay? And then on my clear land, if I grow certain things, I have to abide by the government, okay? And they'll tell me what I can do and what I can't do on my property. It's got to start at the top. I mean, I'm just a schmucky citizen, but that's where it's got to start, okay? Because, you know, I mean, I have to pay my taxes, otherwise, you know what they'll do? They'll take my land from me, all right?
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's where it starts, though. It starts up here,
Yeah.
okay? And that's, you know.
Yeah, thank you for that. Oh, yeah, no, thank you for that. I mean, absolutely. I think that there's probably a combination of education and a lot of pressure, you know, and a lot of this is, you know, some of these politicians, you know, they just may want to get reelected, or they may or may not care that much about these issues. And part of it is, do they hear about these issues? Are they being pushed? Are they being pressured? Because so much of what these politicians decide, you know, yes, campaign finance is a huge issue, and, you know, all of that dominates so much of our system, and then therefore their decisions as well. So you get those things like the food pyramid, you know, and they'll say, you know, they've moved away from, you know, meat and dairy is the best, to now it's just sort of all of the above, you know, and that's sort of like the vague bit of progress. I mean, you know, more plants now, and so some movement in that direction, but it's so slow. And there's a long history of the Dairy Council and the meat industry and just lobbying the heck out of these government agencies who are making these decisions. You know, and now we're getting, again, the appointments in these positions who are like, you know, chief scientist of the USDA under Trump. You know, he's not even a scientist, never mind what kind of scientist, not even a scientist, he has no science background. You know, so examples like that, you know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right, in politics. So it's like, how are we going to We don't really have a unified, we have a lot of food and agriculture groups and movements, and there's a lot of wonderful work being done in this country. But even during the 2016 elections, there were some excellent efforts to try to get it onto the political table, but it didn't really go that far, and there wasn't really kind of unity of getting millions of people to have like some kind of a massive like food justice and sustainability lobby force. So I think that's part of what we really need to, as you're saying, educate and really pressure these politicians. But of course, campaign finance is going to be a big piece of it too. How do we, have to change where they're getting the money from as well. So some of it's also future political leaders, getting to them now. They're so much harder to reach in state and national politics. So.
2 weeks ago, I was in New York at the Women March, and I was really electrified because these women, I think there were much more than 200,000, they said. They started the Me Too movement and Time's Up, and we are the one who care about the family and the food and the health. Being an older lady, Italian, being in the feminist movement in the 60s, I came to this country and I said, why women wanted to progress, which is very good, but the progressing was imitating the men. I remember I went for an interview and my husband said, you cannot wear pants in an interview, you have to wear skirt and nylon. I said, are you out of your mind? I wear what I want. I didn't get the job, by the way. So what I'm saying is we are more than 50% of the population here, mostly are women. So why? This is the unified part. Us, the women who start a new culture of caring and culture of looking at the future, and not this horrible patriarchy represented by this horrible man called Trump. Enough of death. We used to say, make love, don't make war. Where are all these ideas went? Where? I think it's our fault. Mea culpa, mea culpa. Mother who didn't like people drinking and driving, they started a movement. The soccer ball mama vote a different way. So we have to start something different, completely different, radical. Enough with those men. Sorry, you one of the exceptions, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. No, thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying enough with the men already. No, I mean, I think, there's really not much I can add to what you're saying, except to say that, of course I agree, and then I also think that men can and should play a much better role ourselves, and that if we're going to see food, as, I think part of, what you're saying, there's a whole history of nourishment and nurturing and coming out of the family. And of course, we need men to be more of a central part of caretaking families too, and we are somewhat, but that's not an area I'm expert on. But I think that that's something that men can do and should do. Is sort of pick up on as you're saying, women have been so much of the time forced to become more take on certain male traits to succeed, and maybe we'd all benefit if a lot of men took on more women, female traits. As part of our societal success as well. So, I don't know. You said it better than I can say it. So, somebody else have a microphone on them?
Okay. I know that a lot of people have said certain things about our president, but there's a lot more to this. We just came off of 8 years of a president whose wife had an organic garden at the White House. And yet, what was done for us to move forward in this country with the food system that we've been subjected to? Mm-hmm. Nothing. Mm-hmm. But it looked great. Organic garden at the White House, yet nothing was done. He did not stand up for What we kept trying to do, I know that most of you probably have too, signed petition after petition just to have the right to know what's in our food. To me, this is a basic right, and yet there was a president for 8 years that didn't make that happen. So I just want to say something that I thought of. There was a group of 3 teenage girls that kept going to, what's his name? California governor.
Jerry Brown?
No, before that.
Schwarzenegger.
And they kept besieging his office to try to get time with him to put forth their cause, which was poisons, chemicals in skincare products. And they finally, I forget, please forgive me, but you can look it up. They did make a difference. These 3 teenage girls did make a difference because they did not stop. So shame on me for not doing that with our politicians, but I think that that's what we have to do. And I mean, millions of us are signing petitions and that's not working, but I think if we go physically, if we go repeatedly, and if we don't give up, there may be a chance that we can make a change. I can only pray.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just feed off of that great point to close us out, because it's true. You know, I mean, both parties are completely complicit in this situation, and you know, there's a litany of things that Obama did not do that they could have done. So, right. I mean, you know, and there have been little efforts. So let's not, you know, there are areas of progress as well. Yeah, you know, so I'm not one of those like, oh, there's no difference between the two. But the point is, there's not nearly enough of a difference. And the larger point is, again, our entire political system on all levels needs to hear about this, needs to hear about our food system being the set of crises, you know, behind the set of crises that it is, but that it's the solution to so many of these crises, and that so many pieces of that solution are already happening and in place and can be put in place to far greater extent by forcing political deciders at all levels to make these changes. I think a lot of the reason is, you know, they may or may not believe in, for instance, you know, GMOs or, you know, but that's what they're responsive to, because that's not only who lobbies them and pays their campaign bills, but that's also what's seen as the structure that we have. It's seen as the dominant structure. So we have to force them to see that how much that's hurting all of us in society, and how much, you know, again, this is urgent, you know, climate change, health, labor, all these issues. This is urgent stuff, and it has to be changed. It had to be changed a long time ago. And if I could leave you with one thing again, it's, you know, that basic fact that the production of food is the single biggest source of climate change. We need the environmental movement, never mind everybody else, to get their heads around this. And so on every level, food needs to be made as a central piece of our conversation around economics and politics. Thank you all for being here.